we've got more Audiopocalypse Mini-Set cards to review, including a couple shiny new legendaries. I think they're actually pretty crazy. Kicking it off here with Magatha, Bane of Music, a 5-mana 5/5. With Battlecry, draw 5 cards. That is an insane amount of card draw on a stick here with this pretty solid sized minion as a 5/5. Now that said, there is a little downside here. Give any spells drawn to your opponent. So if you are running spells in your deck, this is certainly going to be less appetizing. You're not going to enjoy giving resources to your opponent in most organic scenarios. You want to keep those resources for yourself, but obviously, if you're running a really minion-focused deck, and we already have some of those that are really encouraged to run a lot of minions. If you think about something like Black Rock and Roll in Warrior, right? That is a card that is really encouraging you to build your deck really heavily with minions because you want to get all those extra buffs, right? So you can play something like Black Rock and Roll and then use Magatha to draw through your deck, and that deck just doesn't run a ton of spells. So in many cases, you'll probably hit like 4 or 5 actual cards off of the Magatha, and they might all be insanely buffed. And it doesn't have to be like a super specific setup necessarily either. There are plenty of other decks. If you think about something like, Pure Paladins right now, although obviously this is not a Pure Paladin card, pretend that shape of deck. It's all minions. It's all like early to mid game, just tempo plays. You're trying to get minions out on board all throughout the game. And although Pure Paladin's not going to fit with this, obviously this is a neutral card, there are lots of decks shaped like that historically in Hearthstone, and moving forward there will probably be even more, where this could just be the top end or kind of near the top end of a mid-rangey or aggro minion based deck, and this just serves as a great way to reload and go for that second wave. We actually see that right now in Pure Paladin with cards like Purator. This could fill in the gaps for other decks that do the same sort of game plan, and I know that wasn't the perfect example, but it's just one that's at the top of the meta and very easy to reference right now. So, you can see this fitting into those sorts of shells rather nicely. We've had plenty of very minion-based decks. Weapons are still not a problem. Locations are not a problem. So it's specifically, if you're not running many spells, this might just be a really insane, super efficient way to absolutely reload your hand with tons of resources. Now, of course, this also does exist in this weird space where maybe this could be like a soft counter. If your opponent puts a bunch of Abyssal Curses in your hand, you could Finley those into your deck and then draw those with Magatha. Your opponent would get the Abyssal Curses into their hand instead of yours, right? We've seen things like Bomb Warrior as well in the past, shuffling bombs into your deck. Magatha could be a way to draw bombs and put them in your opponent's hand. So, there's like some weird little stuff that could happen there too, and we might even see like a deck that's built around that, somehow generating negative cards into your deck of yourself and then drawing those and giving them to your opponent. There's also some really weird little mill angles just filling up your opponent's hand. It could be a possibility, although that stuff feels very niche and very unlikely to be good. I think the standard straightforward use case for this, which is a very minion focused, maybe even very weapon focused build for Magatha, makes a lot more sense to me. And in that case, she is just a hyper efficient card draw engine here without really sacrificing hardly anything in regards to stats. So I think she looks really darn good. So moving on here, we've got Elite Tauren Champion, and this card is absolutely bonkers. Really cool design. If you haven't seen this yet, it's kind of complicated, so we'll break down how exactly this works. ETC here is also a 5-mana 5/5 with Finale, start a rock duel. Players must spend all their mana each turn or else they take 8 or more damage. And that text is kind of confusing in its own right, but I think it'll help a lot if you just look here at the token card that ETC generates in this case. That is the Molten Pick of Rock. And it reads, at the end of turn, explode for 8 damage. So basically, ETC is going to generate the Molten Pick of Rock, and he's going to give it to the opponent if his Finale is successfully activated. So they get the Molten Pick of Rock in hand. Once it passes over to their turn, they have to then spend all of their mana in that turn, or the Molten Pick of Rock will explode, and they will take 8 damage. If they do manage to spend all of their mana, though, as you can see, they can give this to the opponent with +2 damage. So basically, it will come back to you, and it will then be, at the end of turn, explode for 10 damage. And if you fail to spend your mana, you're going to take 10 damage. But if you manage to Finale this again and spend all of your mana in that turn, it's going to go back to them, and it's going to be at 12. So basically, it is this hot potato that passes back and forth between the two players' hands. And ultimately, somebody is at some point probably going to take a really big hit of damage unless the game ends organically. Otherwise, as you probably know, Finale is not actually that easy to activate for a lot of decks. Sometimes cards just don't line up well, or if they do, you're making kind of sacrifices that you don't really want to make and making bad plays that aren't as good for the board. So could create this kind of tension on board, as well, of course, just that raw output of total damage. But there's also kind of a strategy or mind games to this as well, which is pretty cool. For instance, like the opponent might just decide to take 8. They may say, look, I can handle 8 right now, but if we pass this back and forth a few times, I absolutely, I don't want to take 16 off of this in a few turns, right? I have to be careful that this actually doesn't get too big. So sometimes you might just take the hit because you want to make the better play or just want to get this out of the way and kind of cap that damage off so that it doesn't become a problem later. And then for the ETC player, there's also that risk, like, oh man, can I even afford to play this? I'm really scared. Like, I don't know if I have a good turn to follow this up. So there might be these moments where it's really awkward for you to actually get this into play. So ultimately, I do think this card is going to be really risky and kind of super situational, and I don't think that many deck lists are going to complement the need to constantly finale over and over again, at least in such a way that it's advantageous over your opponent's ability to finale, so much so that it's worth the risk, because you're kind of introducing this weird risk or this weird downside, and if your deck doesn't have a beneficial way to take advantage of that over the opponents, very often it might backfire more than it actually helps. So is that, potential for 8 or 10 or 12 damage worth the risk? It's really hard to map that out. I think it's going to end up being awkward. People will probably choose more reliable ways to do damage, more consistent outputs, but honestly, who cares? This card looks insanely fun. I want to play games where this thing gets up to 20 damage and people are just passing it back and forth. This is an insanely cool card design. My instincts point towards average at best from a power level standpoint, but insane and amazing from a design standpoint. This looks really, really fun. So next up here we have the Grim Totem Buzzkill. This one's pretty crazy. 4 mana 5/4 Battlecry. Discard a weapon to draw 3 cards. So draw 3 on a 4-drop is cool, but you are losing a resource in hand. So it's kind of like you're netting 2 cards as opposed to netting 3. That said, of course, it's new, different cards as opposed to cards that were already in hand. So if you have a weapon that's not doing much, you have a ton of weapons, and there's a couple sitting dead in hand, right? You can trade out that card that's not useful, that you already knew that wasn't helping your game state, and exchange it for a card that perhaps might give you more options, more plays, more lines down the road, which is generally going to be favorable. And in particular, I talked yesterday in the card review with the Abyssal Basist, the card that gets cheaper as you equip weapons. There's a problem when you do that with weapon density. You don't want too many weapons in a deck, so it's hard to get them out fast enough to discount the Abyssal Basist quick enough to get it into play, is my fear. A card like Grim Totem Buzzkill actually does help solve that problem a little bit, because now if you have too many weapons, if you did have too high of a density, if they're stuck in hand getting clogged up and you can't play them fast enough because you're just burning through durability on weapons too slowly, this comes along and exchanges that density for a more efficient card draw than otherwise might be possible. So basically, we're saying, hey, look, I've got all these extra weapons in hand. Now I can actually turn those into something useful as opposed to just sitting them there dead, which is definitely cool from a design conceit. I really like that this kind of solves a problem that's inherent to another card. Now, that said, is this good enough over other things? Is that still a package that makes sense? Is the Abyssal Basist the big enough payoff to run all these weapons? Is the Grim Totem Buzzkill, enough of a hedge to make that all worth it? I still kind of have my doubts in that case. Plus, this is really conditional, so if you don't have a weapon, this is not drawing you anything. It's just kind of sitting there dead. A lot of classes and decks just won't have enough weapons to make that feel worth it at all. So ultimately, this, I think, looks really specific and really niche. I can only imagine ever 1 or 2 sorts of decks really valuing the Grim Totem Buzzkill, and even then, the odds of those decks being powerful or not just having better card draw options that don't have this really, really high floor for success. In other words, you have to have that weapon in hand to make this good. Probably means this falls short. Although I do think this is a really elegant design and combines pretty nicely with some stuff we've already seen. So moving on, we have the Speaker Stomper, and this dude is just murdering the Stereo Totem, the card we got in the main set if you look closely. It is a 4 mana 4/4. It's got Tradeable, which is crazy, and Battlecry enemy spells cost 2 more next turn. So Yeah, this is kind of a Loatheb slash cult neophyte effect here, somewhere in the middle of those two. And it has Tradeable. Seeing Tradeable again on cards is always nice. We love that keyword. It always adds, I think, base power level to cards that feels good. It feels like they're so much easier to run in various decks. And obviously we know Loatheb long ago, or many of you will know anyway, if you played long ago, Loatheb was insane, super high powered card. He was a 5-mana 5/5 that made enemy spells cost 5 more next turn. And I do have to say, I'm sorry to say, in fact, that's a really big difference. 2 versus 5 is kind of a crazy difference, because Loatheb would basically just like lock out entire turns for certain decks. I could maybe play one card and sometimes couldn't really play anything if he was played on curve. Whereas the Speaker Stomper here is still going to make things possible. 2 is very disruptive. It's annoying. It's going to get in the way. It's going to create some friction for sure, but it's not completely shutting people out. And for that reason, I don't see Speaker Stomper as having that utility that Loatheb had, where he was the kind of finisher almost for a really board-based aggro deck. They'd like swarm you in the early game, then use Loatheb to lock out any sort of response or board clears you might have access to. Speaker Stomper's probably not going to be able to make that happen quite as effectively, won't serve that same utility. Now, that said, I do see Speaker Stomper perhaps in a different role, where I think he'll be a little more niche, not as commonly seen as something like Loatheb, which you could toss into basically any deck, but will still perhaps be valuable in certain metas and in certain environments, which is to say, I think he'll be pretty good as a tech card against spell-based combo decks. So if you think about something like Lady Stheno right now, and Demon Hunter, Lady Stheno can go crazy with lots of cheap spells. And if you're expecting a Lady Stheno turn that's about to murder you, and you want to make sure you get that extra turn, that extra time to do your own combo, your own win condition, to find your heals, whatever it might be, then a card like Speaker Stomper could be used really well to counter that big pop off from your opponent, making it much harder for them to chain various spells together, or play that one really big specific high cost spell, even if it's just a black rock and roll or whatever, which probably not the best example, but it was top of mind from the previous cards. It's like, I don't want them to play black rock and roll on 5. I need more time to stall that out. So I'm going to make it more expensive next turn and basically delay that by a turn. So setting up their setup, their win condition, whatever it might be, delaying that a little bit could be useful, or just denying them that big pop off turn in a given scenario could also be really useful. So decks that have the space to run an extra tech card like this in metas where those sort of things are pervasive, or really, a counter to your deck, Speaker Stomper might come in to help ease some of those problems. So I don't think a general use card that's absolutely everywhere is a tradable Loatheb. I think that's going to catch a lot of people and go, oh my God, it's absolutely insane. Every deck's going to run this. I don't see that personally. I think good still, very useful, very interesting, very powerful, just more selective in its use cases, which is fine. That's a great space for a card to live in. And then finally for this review, we have the Remixed Musician, another remixed card. And again, crazy, they made such cool artwork for this, like neutral common card getting 5 pieces of art. I know there's a lot of reused assets there, but still, they all look pretty cool and distinct. Anyway, this is a 3-mana 3/3 with Rush at a base, and then it also gains an extra effect in your hand each turn, much like we saw with the weapon for Warrior yesterday. Each turn, this is going to roll off into a new effect. So it's sometimes going to get Poisonous, Lifesteal, Divine Shield, and Wind Fury. So of those 4, I have to say Poisonous probably feels like the most useful, just using this to maybe trade into any big threat and use it as a cheap cheap removal card that occasionally has some additional upside. Lifesteal probably feels the least interesting. You guys always seem to love Lifesteal cards, but they just don't usually do all that well. 3/3 is just not a lot of healing, basically, for a small trade on board. Divine Shield, I like a little bit better, plays a little bit better for the board, maybe kills off a couple threats. And Wind Fury sometimes, too, could be nice to kill off a couple small things in the early game, help you pull back some tempo. But ultimately, like I said for the remixed weapon, I think the inconsistency of this card is going to be a huge downfall. Like, oh my God, I need Poisonous so bad, and it's on freaking Wind Fury. What good is Wind Fury trading into a 5/5? You know what I mean? Those sorts of things are going to happen. Or it's like, I just desperately need any kind of heal, and it's on Divine Shield. And there's just going to be so many moments where it doesn't line up well, that the moments where it does line up well are going to feel so few and far between that nobody's going to be able to afford to run this card. Basically, Probably a solid arena card, I'm sure. You know, this is one of those like prototypical, like, oh yeah, it's gonna have some use cases in arena for sure. In standard format though, it just lacks synergy, it lacks package support, and it lacks consistency, which means it lacks play. This card is going to be quickly forgotten, thrown aside in standard constructed play. Might still be fun elsewhere, but you know, cool card, great effort here on the artwork and stuff, just not one I expect to see any degree of play in a constructed standard format. Magatha, Bane of Music is a 4-star card. Elite Tauren Champion is a 3-star card. Grim Totem Buzzkill is a 2-star card. Speaker Stomper is a 4-star card. Remix Musician is a 1-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. Pretty fun stuff. We'll be back, I think, maybe 3 more days worth of reviews, it sounds like, perhaps. So stay tuned over the weekend for even more reviews. Also, stay tuned later tonight. I'm going to be putting out a video. You'll see it. I think you might want to watch it. Some of you will enjoy it. It's going to be a long one, just me talking about a lot of stuff. So stay tuned later this evening for really interesting video, at least for my sake. So love you all a ton. Thanks for watching. See you soon. And until next time, game on.